So just go over what we have done. So the first one, I mean, the whole series is about creation stories, and I had given one talk that embraced all of them at St. Mark's, and so this is really taking one talk and splitting it up into five, except that I think you'll find that it gets more interesting maybe this week, but mostly next week and the week after that, because next week is really the future, which I didn't venture into in the series at St. Mark's, and some speculation about, how long are we going to be around, and should we be around given our behavior, and then the last one deals with the conundrum of my life, which is really religion and science, but mostly it's about religion. Where did that come? Now, there's a bit of a hint of the latter because we'll see how the time goes here, but there's a nice video clip on YouTube here about Lascaux, the cave art, and I think if you're thinking about those kinds of that part of the human experience, it probably began 50, 60,000 years ago. I used to think it was maybe as early as 100,000 years ago or more, Virginia, and I used to think it went further back, but I think just with the information, some of the information I kind of gathered together in the last week, I think it's actually more recent than that. There's such a striking threshold that happens around 50 or 60,000 years ago to modern humans and their behavior and their capability. So I think who we are now isn't all that old, behaviorally, at least we'll get into that. So let's just have a look at, so this is our evolution. I don't want to get tied up in all of this, this can sound like a litany of this character and this character and this character and how they evolved and how long they existed, what did they look like and all that kind of thing, and the kind of the fossil record. I don't really want to get into that because I think the fossil record is extraordinarily rich, but in the big picture, there's a lot missing. And so I hope to kind of dwell on some of that. So let's just see where we go here. Oh, well, here we are. Let Charles Darwin speak for himself. Here he is, his second book, and the one that got him into trouble. And good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. You can come up here where the teacher can watch you.
Yes, I know I'm going to do it in the
Yeah,
essay.
I'm just kidding. Anyway, but I think Darwin was a very perceptive but conservative, cautious man. And I think he's absolutely right in the sentence. The difference in mind between man, notice man, no mention of woman. It's the culture reflected here between man and the higher animals, great as it may be, is one of degree and not of kind. Right on. There's nothing special about humans as a species except in the magnitude of what we can do. We have seen that the senses and intuition, and I must say this is particularly true emotionally and with respect to feelings, kind of thing, not so much cognitively. We're not talking about quantum physics here. We've seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions, such as love, memory, curiosity, of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even sometimes well-developed condition in lower animals. There's a lot of evidence to support that. That's come out, say, in the last 30 years. And that evidence has come from a study of various other social intelligent animals, especially primates. And so I would certainly agree with that. So that would go. So, well, there's a kind of a fetish going on now in neuroscience. We're not going to spend many more seconds on this, but just to say, everyone with the tools now is mapping brains with the ultimate goal of mapping the human brain. So they start small, but already with just the fly brain, the one that I swatted at lunch, is extraordinary. The brain is extraordinarily complex, and no wonder I have trouble swatting it, because those eyes can see behind. And then I realized that after reading the article here, so much of the visual cortex, or at least of the eye, is posterior. So that's your behind. It's best if they are on your window and the light, and then they're much easier to swat. So back here, and here's the mouse. Now, the stuff, they can do so much more now. It's not just a matter of counting nerve cells and their connections and that kind of thing, but the very specific kind of nerve cells and their genetics. So there's a lot more to learn and is being learned. So that even a mouse brain, small as it is incredibly complex. So you can understand why when it comes to the human brain, it's almost hopeless at this point, really, to make a lot of sense of it. So there's comparatively, I mean, just look at the housefly, 350,000 nerve cells. I don't know who counts all these things, but people do. Or the common mouse, I should say 14 million down here. The housefly, 350,000, and the human, around 100 billion, somewhere in there. So a lot. And if you realize that on the average, every single neuron is connected to, on the average, several thousand other nerve cells. So you can imagine the kind of the network, the complexity of the network in the brain, and why we have trouble trying to sort things out. And here, just as in a nutshell, I don't want to get into a lot of stuff, but really the story began with the flowering of an ape species, the original apes. And it's also in that 10 million years ago illustrates the fragility of life, because, doesn't it? Climate change here was associated. The climate got a lot warmer. And there was a lot colder, and there was a loss of all that kind of tropical forest for a lot of them, certainly in Europe, and where there were a lot of ape species in Europe, some of them bipedal, and they were gone. We're almost gone. One of which survived, which is our ancestral ape species that eventually gave rise to gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos and us. So it's a story, from an evolutionary point of view, it's a pretty short history. I mean, it sounds like a lot when I speak of millions of years, but as I mentioned last week, with life's beginnings, that's a story that goes back 2-3 billion years. So it's a long time coming. And in fact, our evolution is pretty rapid. And I'm not going to go into all of these species, except mention down here, there's Afarensis, the famous Lucy, the Australopith, and associated with Leakeys, discovering Afarensis. But it illustrates the problem. I mean, only a few fossils have been found before, say, 3 million years, or before 4 million years ago. So how do you actually draw a roadmap when all you have is a jaw for one, or part of the skull for another, or something of a hip bone for another, and you infer from where the spinal cord goes in the base of the skull, and if it's from beneath, the species was probably bipedal most of the time. We stand up and our spinal cord is entering the base of our skull here. But with quadrupeds, it's entering much higher. Okay, so you can get an idea from where the spinal cord enters the base of the skull, whether they were quadrupeds or bipedal. But pretty fragile evidence. I mean, fossils don't last all that long, even when they're mineralized. And so the record is spotty. But clearly the clock doesn't go backwards. The brain doesn't get bigger going backwards. But there is this rough change. And you know, I think there are now close to 30 identified species between, say, 4 or 5 million years ago and us. It sounds like a lot, it isn't. There are probably a lot of those species that for nothing's been found, no fossils been found. Some of them are called, these days, ghost species, meaning if you do genomic studies, it's obvious that there was another species, but there's no fossil to match because it didn't survive, especially in Africa and West Africa where it's wet and stuff doesn't last. And so clearly the picture is more complex than this. And at any one time, in certain regions of East Africa, there might have been 3 or 4 different versions around at the same time. And maybe all 4 of them on 2 feet. And their gait might have differed a little bit, their brain not much. And so it's a far more complex picture. Now imagine if you, back in 1900, there had only been 2 ancient, 3 I should say, fossils discovered of early, if you're trying to reconstruct a map, 3. So now we're up to kind of 50, and that's about it. But clearly there's a lot more, and now with all the building and the change of the land and reuse of land and that kind of thing, many of them we won't find to fill in the blanks. So, so we went here. So here's the famous one. I like this. Michael Shermer. That's this interesting, tells this interesting story. He has an amateur telescope at home, and he imagined looking through his telescope at Andromeda. Andromeda is the closest galaxy to ours. And he realized that the light falling on his retina began its voyage from Andromeda 3.3 million years ago. That's how long it took the light to go from Andromeda, about the time that Lucy was walking on the Earth. It's a wonderful perspective to make, because it illustrates the magnitude in time and space that are really important. We were talking to somebody before I came in here that, one of the big lessons for me in all of this is the perspective, it's the size of the canvas. We're so used to living in our local politics and our own kind of time, and history is kind of going back 50 years or 20 years or 10 years, and or maybe 100 years, whatever. 2,000 years sounds like a lot. It's not. It's a drop in the bucket of a continuing processes in the Earth's physical processes, chemical processes, biological processes, and that perspective is important. Now, the footsteps, I just love footprints because they tell a story. It's obvious here. You don't have to be a paleoanthropologist to realize that there are 2 sets of prints here. This is the adult, and if we walk along here, this is about the pace, right? About a foot in length between steps. So you walking casually, you're really quite comfortable and at ease. And you've got a youngster walking along beside you with a little mortise, just keeping up. And standing and walking fluidly bipedal, with a brain the size of a chimpanzee, so not all that bright, but on its way. And the other thing about it is that we can do this. We can oppose our thumb, and we can do this, right? And that made a huge difference to what we could do in cutting things with scissors and writing with a pen and all that kind of thing, that opposable thumb. And furthermore, the brain thought it was very important because it devotes an enormous amount of its cortical activity to those two digits and what they do. In fact, it directly controls those nerve cells in the spinal cord. There are no interneurons in between them. But apes, tree climbing apes, also have opposable thumbs or big toes, because that helps them climb the tree, right? Okay, to get a grip on the tree. And so that was one of the changes. But so repurposing the limbs, and I love this. I don't know how many times I've told this story. I was talking to my daughter Martha. It's one of the things that we want to do in a trip coming up. But these are footprints on the south coast of Spain. They go back 110,000 years. There are 36 or 37 prints, pairs, 20 of them adult, the rest kids. How do you know the difference? Well, size. Number one, the adults are all close to one another. And the kids are out ahead, jumping back and forth, and I can imagine playing. I cannot imagine that those adults were not talking. This could be any sea. It could be a Lake Huron. It could be in the Mediterranean, where any beach anywhere. It's a wonderful image, and it's 110,000 years ago. So it's really quite extraordinary. What was that we saw that? And well, then this could be, I could fill in other species in here, but the big picture is that over the last two and a half million years, the brain got a lot bigger, and our hominin predecessors became fluidly bipedal, but fluidly they could run. And running was important because they could actually run game down. They may not be able to outrun some of the animals, but kept up. Eventually the game fails. But humans have their biochemistry of their muscle is such that they are endurance runners. And eventually, if they kind of keep it up, they catch up. But anyway, the brain virtually kind of doubled here. And I mentioned ghost species, I've already mentioned that. So the number of ghost species, meaning for which there is no fossil, but there is DNA evidence that someone existed. So it becomes complicated. Now, I put this up because the original evidence for the origin of humans being in Africa came from using mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, there are only about 16 or 17 genes in a mitochondria, so there isn't much, it isn't 3 million genes. And so it's much easier technically to kind of deal with. And they use that to date when the origins for humans of the mitochondrial Eve, remember the term? around 135,000 years ago. If you use Y chromosomal male DNA, it's around the same, 142, so at least they match. And that's the genetic evidence. Is there an error of this kind of thing? Well, here's mitochondrial DNA for the estimate for the arrival in the Americas. Well, they've done a lot more precise measurements now. And actually the date is 22,000 years ago. Now, if you imagine that, that meant that's in the glacial, right in the middle of the most severe part of the glacial period. There would have been a huge land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. And the water levels would have been hundreds of feet lower in the ocean, but terribly cold. Yet people managed to get from Siberia into the Americas and all the way down. Now, they didn't go, oh, let's go down to New Mexico. There would have been stopovers, and maybe whole families would have lived in one place for maybe a few, 2 or 3 generations or 5 generations before kind of moving on. So that's what's really happening. This isn't the wagon train moving down to the southern states and into Central America and South America. Anyway, that's, well, here's one of the fellows that I partnered with some years ago, Robin Dunbar at Magdalen College in Oxford. He was very interested, or he thought the brain evolved not so much because of kind of you know, using tools, but evolved because of social complexity. And the larger the social group, the harder it is to keep track of people. Well, just think about it in your churches or wherever you go, keeping track of names, who's who, who's in, who's out, who's grouped with who, what their views are and that kind of thing. Where do you fit into that? That social complexity, his postulate is, that's what drove the expansion of the brain. You needed a larger brain to navigate the larger groups. And he came up with various group sizes, which you can see on this side. You know, I really like Robin Dunbar, but I think he's wrong. Certainly with respect to Neanderthals, they never got up to 120. In fact, what did them in on the record is much smaller groups and interbreeding because of those smaller groups. That's what did them in. And so it wasn't because of their group size. It's pretty rare, I think. I don't think any site's ever been found that would ever suggest 120. I mean, when I say 120, that doesn't mean 120 modern humans kind of in one tent. What it means is that the overnight group might be 20, 30, maybe a stretch to 40. But I'm speaking of Aboriginal peoples now in the record. That's what it might be. But like-minded and cultured similar groups would be close. So there might be several overnight groups, and they would get partners for marriage. Usually it was the women who moved, not the men. The men stayed with the group. The women moved to the other group. But by the way, that's the same thing with chimpanzees. The women out, and the males stay. It's an interesting thing. Not so much, it's the reverse with bonobos. It's the men who move and the women who stay. They're the ones that resolve all social conflicts with sex and are far less aggressive than chimpanzees as a group, so probably nicer to deal with. And so Well, here's something that you mentioned. We were talking about glacial periods, and I just put this, this is, I think, the second time I mentioned it in this series, but just talk about perspective here. These glacial periods are dictated by the path of the Earth around the sun, which changes from almost circular to a bit of an ellipse. And furthermore, the Earth tilts. And it even wobbles. And why does all of that happen? Because, and I mentioned this before, because of all of the planets in the solar system have a certain mass, and therefore they create a gravitational, there's a gravitational effect, and the summed gravitational effect of all the planets on the Earth is what changes that path, that cycle every 100,000 years, that cycle between glacial periods, great cold, lower ocean sea levels, and warmer periods. And we're in an interglacial period right now. And so I mentioned that because we're going to talk about a major extinction, which I mentioned before here. And on this time scale, that happened right in here. About 950,000 years ago, we almost went extinct. And we almost did it again, and you may not know about this, around here. Around 70,000 years ago, because of a major volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Almost did us in. And and what was the magnitude of that? Well, you've seen this, but if we, where's my pointer? I don't have my pointer. But anyway, you can see here, number one, don't ever think that there were a lot of humans around at any one time. There weren't. Based on genomic estimates, probably no more than, say, 100,000 in all of Africa and Europe. That tells you there are probably relatively small groups dispersed from one another and vulnerable. And then look what happens around 950,000 years ago. Well, all of a sudden the population of, this is a breeding females, this is what we're talking about, a number here, drops from almost 100,000 to less than 1,500. That's clearly, talk about a genetic bottleneck, it doesn't get much worse than that. And first of all, and furthermore, it lasted for well over 100,000 years. And the glacial record is that for that long period, Africa was, it was a glacial period, and it was very dry and arid, and the land changed. There were far fewer animals to feed on, and forest and plants, that kind of thing. So they were in jeopardy. And to back that up, if you look at the fossil record, the fossils almost drop off. I mean, there's some in here, but the fossil record thins out for a corresponding period. So that fits. Even if the exact numbers, by the way, the reason for getting 98,130 doesn't mean that 98,130. That's what the math, the mathematical model comes up with. Doesn't mean that at all. So it's better to talk about 100,000 down to less than 5,000 or less than 3,000. And even that, there's a guesstimate. But there's no denying how much of a change it is. It is huge. And furthermore, it lasts a long time until when? Behaviorally modern humans come along. And when do they come in? Right in here. That's when the population booms. That's when the out of Africa movement begins. So you can see how the pictures are coming together. By the way, these are all in between here, pre-human hominins, all evolving along the way and changing. But for modern humans that behave like us, that's when the dispersal and when the population bloomed. And so pretty fragile to begin with, because there weren't too many humans, of course none at all in the Americas, and but gee, not very many at all in Africa and in Europe, and probably Asia. Well, you know, this is a kind of made-up one. What did one of those pre-human species around that period look like? Well, you know, with a good haircut and maybe a suit, that kind of thing. Maybe it doesn't quite look like us, but not bad. And so it took a long time for pre-human hominins to develop culture and sophisticated culture, and certainly language. Language would have come late in this. Sophisticated language would have come late. And that's a summary of all that I've said. So there's what happened, this genetic bottleneck, loss of 2/3 of the genetic diversity. And so that was serious. That's one of the two that we know about. Now the other thing is, well, when did we actually, in that pre-human flow to, well, here's Homo sapiens, and so here we are, say 1 million years ago, when that near extinction took place around here. Not far after that, within 100 or 200,000 years, one limb heads towards Homo sapiens, the other one heads towards Neanderthals and Denisovans over here, and the branch to chimpanzees and what would become bonobos 7 million years ago. That's the flow. But what's not in here are those ones for which there's genetic evidence, but no fossils. So the record is clearly more complex than what I'm showing you here, and it's likely to remain very complex. So let's see. Now here's the population. Evolution, one of the things about humans, what makes humans special? If you think about, well, we think about language and writing and music and art, and then we realize that some of those, Neanderthals certainly, and probably Denisovans did have some talents in that regard, but one of the big things is the population size. Because look at this. Here's Homo sapiens in Africa, I said probably around 100,000. By the time the cave art, meaning modern humans producing it, 50 to 40,000 years ago, down to agriculture. Here, that flowering of art, not only in Europe, but in Indonesia, of similar quality. The population is still quite low, isn't it? 100,000, 500,000, not a lot. But agriculture, wow, look what happens. Population's up to 6 million, around 10,000 years ago. City-states, 50 million. First empires, 120 million. The time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, we're up to 250 million. The Renaissance, 500 million. Industrial Revolution, almost 1 billion. Just before World War I, 1.6, 1.7. You know, when you look at the population statistics, you wonder, humans survive catastrophes when they have large numbers like this. They're easily endangered when the number's down to 100,000. But when you get into multiples of 100,000, that kind of thing, it doesn't seem to matter whether there's a pandemic, a major war, and like the Second World War, and millions die, the population rebounds in no time at all. That's one of the staggering things that strikes me when I look at these population numbers. This is not like an extinction event or anything anywhere near it. In fact, the contrary. So, and here we are in 25, we're all over 8 billion and slated to, now projections into the future are pretty dicey, but that climb is going to continue but begin to decelerate, slow down, but still rise to say 2050 so, and hopefully so, because because we're gobbling up all the land. Where's the wild anymore? And, oh, sorry, when. Now, the Denisovans, this is an interesting kind of mysterious group, originally found in Siberia, named after the cave, and branches kind of sprouted up in Tibet and Thailand, and certainly their genes throughout Southeast Asia. So Aboriginal peoples in Australia, New Zealand, or the equivalent in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere, all carry Denisovan genes. And but it's fascinating. Sorry, I think I got this. Oh, there's a jaw. But this one really struck me because this is one of the dwellings in Quebec. Well, first of all, it's at 10,000 feet. If you fly, you realize the temperature drops 2 degrees centigrade per 1,000 feet. So it may be kind of a nice temperature at sea level, but it's gone down 20 degrees to zero. And this is your home? How do you get into it? Now this is where the investigators in the cave are going, but it looks pretty steep to me. And how do you get around? How do you hunt? How do you do anything? It couldn't have been a large group, and they probably went extinct for the same reason that the Neanderthals did. The groups were too small, too dispersed, and through loss of genetic diversity. That's probably what's happened to them, is the imagination of what one of them might have looked like, pretty good looking. Small chin, big teeth, a brain actually bigger than ours. And now these are two Neanderthal reconstructions. Boy, they look very different, don't they? This one looks like he's been in too many fights. And this one could be us, except he needs a haircut and trim, and he'd fit right in. The interesting thing about this is it was in this time period, or in the say prior to, say, well, 20,000 years ago, it's very uncommon for humans and pre-human hominins to live longer than 30 years. That's an extraordinary thing. So when you talk about an old sage or a shaman holding forth in the group, they're actually young. The old adults were in their late 20s. That's an extraordinary thing. And that was true for both Neanderthals, Denisovans, and for those artists who created the cave art in Europe. In fact, there's no genetic record of them now, of those artists, in modern humans. So something happened to all of them. And of course there were successive waves from Eastern Europe and Russia through, I'm not talking about mass killings or anything like that. We don't know what happened. but certainly successive waves went through Europe, displacing people. So, well, and here's the issue, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but here's the issue in Russia, just like that in Tibet. Here's the estimate for the number of Neanderthals, the population estimate for West Russia, the total, the 1,000. How do you sustain a species with 1,000, and given that those are small groups, and the number in this cave was probably no more than 12. And you can imagine if the hunt that year, something happened to the hunt and they weren't available or as available, or the climate was really got cold, or for whatever reasons, fragile, and you'd simply be wiped out. And that's in fact what happened to them. So here's the difference anatomically between a Neanderthal brain on the left and the modern, the Neanderthal on the right and the modern human on the, well, this is human over here. And the main difference, I mean, I don't want to get into phrenology, which was a fetish of the 1800s, wasn't it? And the early 1900s, you could somehow figure out what the brain was like by feeling the shape of the skull. But nonetheless, there are differences. The human brain is a more globular one, and the Neanderthal one, actually the temporal lobes and part of the frontal lobe not as well developed. But and there are, never mind that phrenological thing, but here's an interesting thing. The Neanderthals were the first to create flutes. And here's one, 60,000 years ago. And actually, modern flutists can play instruments like that and get reasonable music out of them. So they knew something about spacing of those holes, the central hole and the kind of the side holes. I don't know enough about the flute, but anyway, they apparently were. So it goes back a long time. So this tells us music was around 60,000 years ago, and probably dance. And that may be language, symbolic language, I think. There's no evidence of anything like this at all in the record prior to 100,000 years ago. Nothing, anywhere. So this is us. And also one thing, I won't get into the process here, but if you use Neanderthal DNA for certain, for the brain, the DNA that determines which cells are going to be which cells and how they're going to behave, very much depends on the species, and there are differences between Neanderthal brains and human brains. And it turns out that not much of a change makes a huge difference. Just one amino acid change in one protein, and there's a significant loss of nerve cells, or fewer nerve cells, in the brains of Neanderthals compared to modern humans. Or if you take that same human gene variant and plant it in a early growing organoid, a few centimeter model of the Neanderthal brain, it takes on a human characteristics. And just one change, one amino acid in one protein, and you know the proteins consist of hundreds of amino acids. So on the surface, it doesn't sound really like much, but it has a huge impact in later development. So back here. Well, these are the things that just talking about what makes us unique, if you like. And I'm not going to read out all this stuff because you know it. But But clearly, there's a human flute, by the way, 20,000 years later. It looks more sophisticated, it is. But the truth of the matter is, there is nothing like this in the record at all with any other species than our own, and before, say, 40 or 50,000 years before. And most of it concentrated 20 to 30,000 years ago. So I think the flowering of human cognition is more recent than I thought. And the other thing is, only humans do this kind of thing. The figure on the right, combine the body of one species with the head of another. I mean, that takes a fair bit of imagination to do that, and to do it fairly regularly. It shows up in some of the cave art, I mean, the stuff is I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just absolutely stunning stuff. The sense of movement, and imagine that with a flickering light. This is not a 150 watt bulb on here with a steady light, the way this photograph is taken. And this one really got to me, and so I did this. Here's Robert Bateman's picture. It's a moonlit night. It's a full moon. There's a fair bit of light. And you look what's happening. There are two wolves in the foreground. 3, 4, 5. They're all pointed in the same direction. He doesn't show you what they're looking at, but it's probably something to eat. And I'm glad I'm not the object of what they're looking at here. But I thought it was an interesting thing, because here's Robert Bateman. I admire some of his stuff, or much of his stuff, but he has a studio, an indoor studio, and all the equipment the accoutrements to do this kind of fine work. And then we go back to this other stuff, and and the canvas here is a calcite, relatively soft stuff, and water impervious rock underneath that. That's the canvas. You can't go out and buy the canvas. And furthermore, you're working in the dark, unless somebody's holding a light for you. You know, it might not be a stable one. And furthermore, it might not be in much of a space. You maybe have to crawl into some space. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. These caves were often linked with one another, with kind of very narrow passageways between them. And yet there's the art on the roof, sides. Somebody got through there. How did they do it? And the other thing is that I really find fascinating is these caves, many of these caves were occupied more than once, meaning there's all evidence, say in some of them, that a cave was occupied for several thousand years. Then the record stops. And then several thousand years later, another group is in there. And the extraordinary thing is they add art, but they don't erase art. No one came in with an eraser and said, oh, look at the junk that's up on that wall. I want to redo my house and take all the stuff out. And that's the extraordinary thing. And it's why I like to think of some of these caves as the ancient, I shouldn't say ancient, but old, they're the equivalent of cathedrals. The repository of the finest in architecture and art for the time. And they were a place of celebration where there would have been music. We have the instruments, drums, flutes, and there would have been ceremonies. What kind of ceremony? Was it a religious kind of ceremony of sorts? Was this the beginning of religion in some form? Maybe, could have been. certainly required a lot of imagination. I think probably yes to all those. So, well, here we are, the other footprints, Apollo 11. And I mentioned this because, just in this last century and a half, the pace of human understanding and has just, there's nothing in the historical record like it. And it's an exponential increase, partly related to the population increase, many more scientists, if you like, involved in this stuff, many more institutions that support it. Just look at what's happening now in China. And deciphering the brain. And I mention this because some of you in the room will remember Peter Earle with ALS, and he lost his ability to speak. And there were, at that time, 2 or 3 years ago, several centers in the United States, one in Switzerland, there may have been others I don't know about, but anyway, deciphering the kind of message of the brain and the speech area, and translating that with AI into words. And as you might expect, the first version were pretty crude, a vocabulary of 100 words, and a third of them were errors in coming up with the right word. It is now in the thousands of words, and the error rate now is well under 1%. And now it's gone beyond that, with the ability to actually figure out what people are thinking about. It sounds extraordinary, doesn't it? But follow the curve. It's clearly where this is going. And this was not because they were recording from more sites in the brain. They weren't. They were only recording from maybe 100 little electrodes, little recording sites, with all of these studies. And but deciphering that information, breaking the code of that information, and understanding what kind of signal stands for this word or that word, or this thought, or this feeling, or that kind of thing. I think they're really on the path, which is both worrisome, I think, but none of us, we will not be able to stop this. It would require a worldwide consensus, and we already know that the fatal flaw with humans is that, and our biggest flaw, the one that will do us in, is that we can't agree on anything. We straight arm people who don't think the way we are, in the same culture, whatever it is. I mean, plenty of people are generous that way, but just one look at the world right now in the Middle East and other places tells us, and the last century, a perfect lesson in human behavior. And so I don't have any faith that we're headed in that direction. So it is interesting, this interesting throwaway comment by Picasso, who was a great fan of Kiefer, made this interesting point: we have nothing to teach them. That's quite a compliment to an artist working many thousands of years earlier than him. That's impressive. And that's the thing. I mean, from a cognitive, intellectual thing, I think humans we are exceptional. But socially and behaviorally toward one another and other species. I mean, any map now looking at the extinction rate for other species is a steep rise up, whether on the ocean or on land, and with no end in sight. And so this is not a comfort. Now, we did, let me just try this. This is Lascaux. You may have seen this. But let's see.
The real Cave of Lascaux is close to the
Neat.
public,
So-
and it's located all the way in France. We're going to go on a virtual field trip and check out the cave on the computer screen. Here we go.
Let's see. This is a quickie kind
We're
of
going to
tour.
walk through the cave right now. Pretend like we're really there.
This is not the real cave, this
After
is
we
the facsimile,
once,
because
we're
humans
going
were
to go
screwing
back
up
in
the
and
original,
look at some of these boxes that
like
you
just
see
breathing carbon
in here.
dioxide.
This is the main entrance.
It's the scale of it.
The cave has names.
That's impressive.
Paintings in areas.
And
Sometimes
where
we
the
use
art
the
was
ceiling.
put. Here's the famous art of,
You'll notice lots of earthy colors, reds, browns, tans, yellowish tones,
that larger space might contain 30 or 40
black,
people,
gray.
so it's that large. How many of you have been there?
Some parts of the cave are real
Well,
bumpy,
some of my hit
which
list.
would have been hard for the Stone Age artists to paint on. Some parts get very, very narrow.
Access to these caves has really been cut to maybe a third of them now, and the numbers climbing, because carbon dioxide corrodes the calcite, and you see patches kind of falling off, and it's awful.
Some areas have carvings or engravings of animals. We'll look at those more closely.
I just can't imagine how artists could do stuff from such positions in such cramped places and create such beauty. And I can't help but think that these are very emotionally charged. One of the things that I left out was Richard Leakey. I think I mentioned this to you. But Richard Leakey, the paleontologist with the two famous parents, he went through this cave as a teenager. His parents wanted him to see it. He was totally bored. He could hardly wait to get that out. And then he went back as an established paleoanthropologist, and with the discovery of the Turkana Boy and other discoveries and that kind of thing, well established in the late 30s, he was totally wowed.
We're nearing the end of the cave now.
And he wrote a piece, which I forgot, but I'll bring it next week to share with you. It's a magnificent piece of writing, but it's also his idea of what might have happened in the Hall of Bulls. What was going on in these places? It's,
Find our way out, you'll see that there's been a modern entrance and exit created.
anyway, it's just,
Walk through this wide hallway.
I don't know, I find it very moving. And that's the exit to the thing. And I think it's,
Set aside to the trench coat.
that sense of awe is present in science. It's also present
Okay.
in
We're going to walk through this just one more
various
time.
religious
and I'm gonna point
traditions.
out a few things.
with which I'm familiar, at least with my own.
It's a guided tour.
And
You may have noticed these little boxes popping up throughout the
Oh.
first tour. If I click on them,
we'll stop
this
this.
is called the left wall or the uniform panel.
No, Debbie.
Really neat stuff. When I click on
Wait a
this,
minute.
you can read up more about the individual works of art. You can also zoom in on certain
No,
ones.
I stop.
You can really
Without
check
getting
out the
Debbie back in
colors.
here, but
Right.
just
You
wanted
might
to
notice
share this
here
with you
that
because
this particular
the stuff is so studied, and there's so much of it in such a short time that I think,
this freeze
from the
of all
Hall
the
of
animals,
Wolves.
and you can click on
But
other areas
anyway,
like the
it's so studied, it represents a
One of the things I love
threshold.
about this art, I'm
in
gonna zoom in
human
on this one,
evolution.
clicking this box.
And
It's
they
just
gradually
how
worked up,
unbelievably
began
infinite
maybe
all the
100,000 years
layers
ago in
and
bits and
colors.
pieces in South Africa
You
and
can
various
see
other
here
places.
that many of these
But
were maybe done by
then
different artists or in different
with the accessibility of caves and a made-to-order canvas, if you like, for working on. But there are over 300 sites in Western Europe. It's extraordinary. Neanderthals, 60,000 years ago, but they're kind of stick figures. And maybe modern humans have been doing stick figures at the same time, I don't know. But it certainly puts, for me, a frame on the thing about, well, just how far back would I have to go to find somebody somewhat like us, with a similar imagination, similar gifts, and a way to ask that, I mentioned this before in Papua New Guinea. There are at least 100 different tribes. We're up to, say, to the post-war period, 1940s, late 40s, 50s. And as Westerners moved in off the coastal plantations and inland, they found 100 different languages plus, more or less saying the same thing gesturally, and a Stone Age existence. And within 30 years, and less than that with the young, speaking their language, going to university, getting degrees, which tells me that the brain was capable of all of that. Well, it was living a Stone Age existence. And it also suggests to me that their life was every bit as complex as ours. Maybe not quantum physics, that kind of thing. But to survive in that thing, you had to have an intimate knowledge of nature. Every plant, everything that wiggled or that you understood. And you may have even developed stories about it and your relationship to them. So clearly the brain was capable, which then brings in the doubt. The flip side, when I think about this, did this birth us, people behaved and thought like us, was it really with this, or were they capable of this earlier, and much earlier, but the opportunity wasn't there. After all, people, these artists must have had the time to do this. They weren't out foraging. There were others out foraging, getting the meals, so to speak. And these are professional artists. It took a long time to do this stuff, and a lot of support in the community. So maybe, I don't know, it's wishing, I don't know where that threshold, and maybe the threshold was crossed in many places around the globe at more or less the same time. That's certainly true. Any evidence of early language, the kind of things that might trip you to that, more or less happened in China and East Asia and in Europe at about the same time, without a connection between them. And interestingly enough, written language appeared. If you look at the records, when did it actually appear? Well, it wasn't just in Mesopotamia. It was happening in China just about the same time. In fact, China led. They weren't connected between the two. The calligraphy was very, very different, right? And yet there was a written language. So what happened? How did a species mature in much the same way, disconnected from one another, and somehow figure it out?
It's like twins.
Like twins that haven't met each other. Right on. Right on. So I think it's a really interesting story. The other odd thing is that the relative absence of humans. You don't see any portraiture. You see portraiture for the animals' head. By the way, all the animals are almost on side view, but the heads turned to the viewer. So you see the head turned and the antlers and whatever it is, and that kind of thing. And they're kind of mixed. Can you imagine living in a place where there's a rhinoceros in Europe? Rhino, really? And there were. And so this week was really to just in an hour kind of sum up human evolution. But next week it gets more interesting, at least for me. What was, and I can't be wrong because I won't be around to find out if I'm wrong. But about what is our future, and then we'll move on to religion, which has really been the driver for all of this for me. Any thoughts? No?
The other thing that came to me is you had mentioned the primitive tribes in Borneo and places like that and how quickly they changed. I remember reading articles about cargo cults and how they started in some of those tribes. If a fridge had happened to fall from a plane, they would think it came from the sky, so that would be an idol for them, apparently. And the first time they saw, say, a white female or a white male, well, that was not their life, so all of a sudden they have to be gods, perhaps. These cargo cults really existed for a long time, I think. Well, probably for a very short time in the islands anyways.
Yeah, I can tell you the response to outsiders in Papua New Guinea was that you're a meal.
You're a meal, yeah.
For both Westerners and the Japanese.
So that wasn't a cargo cult, that was food.
Yes, except the Japanese were stupid enough to abuse them, and especially their women.
Oh.
And the Australians were smart enough not to. And that helped out a thing. Yeah. So it's an extraordinary story. I realize this is long history. I mean, I got into this because of two books on David Christian, who is my brother is a historian, but anyone I know who is a historian is really a historian of the last 1,000 years or 100 years or that kind of thing. There's no scale like that. David Christian's an Australian who decided, hey, listen, history really began with literally, in his case, the Big Bang, and then traced it all through, and then so that was the one who really kind of framed the whole thing for me, because here was somebody who is willing to dig out the stuff and try to figure out enough of the science to make sense. Plus, he's a very good historian. And then he ran into he got the attention of Bill Gates. And you know, Bill Gates is a big reader, devotee of different subjects, educating himself. And he invited him, he does with other people, to live with him. Well, Winston Churchill used to do that. If he wanted to pick somebody's brain, he'd invite them for the weekend, for a week, and then your brain would be picked. I mean, that's how some of the history that, not in those books, but certainly in those 6 volumes of wartime history, somebody's brain was being picked. So that's what Bill Gates did, and then gave him a lot of money for a foundation, and thought that this kind of history is the untold history that really needs to be told. And I certainly grabbed onto that. And the other one is Chris Stringer, and a person I've met a few times. If you want to go on to YouTube, you'll see why I like him. Chris Stringer, he likes to be called Chris Stringer, even formally. And but there's a group in London, England, a museum of human history, and that's what he runs. I don't think he runs it anymore. Somebody else was, but very active, still publishing. But he has a lovely way of telling stories, and he really hit home with this whole business of when did morality begin? When did when did that begin? Now, his real thing was Neanderthals, that kind of thing, and he's a high-powered guy in genetics and that kind of thing, but his core interest was that. So how far back do you have to go? How long ago do you have to go to look for long-term care in some fashion? Because if you think about it, if you're in those caves, it's very expensive looking after somebody in time and feeding them and supporting them. And if your group is only 12 and you have somebody who can't hobble around and is totally dependent on the other 11, that's a costly thing to do. And yet there is clear evidence that, and several examples, that that's precisely what was done with Neanderthals and humans, antedating what we would think of as a religious kind of teaching, if you like. And even other species look after one another. I mean, primates, the chimpanzees are well aware of when they're being treated unjustly, or their friend is being treated unjustly, or the strangers being treated unjustly. Wow. That reminds you of a little biblical story? And so the point that he brings up is, in that book, Lone Survivor, and it's a good one to read because he's a good writer, but he's also tapped into a lot of experts, so the information is good. That long-term care and social societies that look after one another go back a long, long time. Now, did they beat each other up from time to time? Absolutely. But we do it a lot more than they did. And systematically, as we see in Gaza these days. So it gets at the roots of moral, ethical behavior, and when did that come in? And because that's part of what, we have a service to go to at 5 o'clock, and we're be saying certain things, and how unique are those things that we're saying to us versus others? And I think those are general things. That's my take on things. Yeah, Steve.
You said they would look after each other. Wasn't it fairly common, say for the Inuit, when a person got elderly, they would just walk off and leave?
Oh, yes, that kind of thing, and well understood to be so.
Yes.
If you were, that's a different issue. That is somebody, there was Bronowski had that series, what, in the 1990s?
Yes.
And he mentioned, or one of the shows, weekly shows in the series, the illustration was of a group that annually moved from Turkey down into northern Syria, and back and forth, a seasonal thing. And it was through mountainous country.
Yes.
And one of the rivers was known to be very fast and heavy and very risky, and very risky for children, so they certainly protected the children and mothers. But the elderly, all on their own, without being asked, understood that this is their time.
Mm.
And they would, and people would say goodbye to them, and that's what they did. And yeah, I think there are those kind of examples.
Migrating peoples.
Yes,
Perhaps.
yes, well, yes, but in situations, another classic example that's really stunning was 35,000 years ago, a long time ago, in Indonesia, the time of the art in Indonesia, and and a young woman, we don't know what happened to her, but she apparently fell, and she fractured both legs, and they were bad fractures, and the tibia, and fibula, and you know, the stunning thing is, when they looked at the bones, she was operated on, an amputation was done
Oh, well.
properly. The edges of the bone were properly done the way a modern day surgeon would do, and she clearly survived. There was clearly no infection, and she wouldn't have been able to walk. And so here's a group, one in the group that wouldn't have been able to forage and fend for herself, yet the group supported her. We don't know what she died of, but it was some years later. And but the surgery was, I mean, by modern eyes, it could have been done better. Certainly a lot better than the American Civil War, or First World War, and even the Second World War. I mean, the mortality rate in the Boer War was 50%. If you had anything like that, woman, you're going to be dead. Your chances are half that you'd be dead. And yet here's somebody who had the skill to do this. And so I think wanting to do things to support other people, and in some cases skillfully, is deeply rooted. Okay, all right, so on to the future next week, and then religion. And yeah, so that was good, I enjoyed it. I watched this on YouTube last night. I'm glad Debbie set it up, but it's kind of nice doing it just privately, because you see it better and you can hear it better. And similar things have been done for several of the other Kiev art pieces, and so that's well worth to. And there's a whole literature on this subject. I mean, I've got a fair number of books at home on this, but I'm only touching it. So it obviously has caught people's attention. By the way, this place, Mescal, man, do you know when it was found? 1940, the year that Germany invaded France and walked under the Arc de Triomphe, right? And this would have been, at least in the first couple of years before or 3 years before Germany took it all over, this would have been under French control. But anyway, discovered by a little girl. Kind of wandered into the cave. All right, so on to next week. Thank you.
Thank you.